On the 5th of October, 1789, several thousand women marched out of Paris in the rain, headed for the Palace of Versailles, 12 miles away. They were not soldiers, they were fishwives and market women and laundresses. They carried kitchen knives and broom handles and a few pikes, and somewhere in the column they were dragging cannon. They walked for 6 hours through the mud. They were not marching for liberty. They were not marching for the rights of man, or for a constitution, or for any of the grand ideas that we now attach to the French Revolution. They were marching because the price of bread had gone through the roof, and their children were hungry, and the king was eating. When they reached Versailles, they flooded into the palace. By the next day, they had forced Louis XVI to leave the seat of his ancestors and come back with them to Paris, riding in a carriage surrounded by women who had spent the night in his corridors. As the procession moved down the road, the crowd is said to have chanted that they were bringing home the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's little boy. The king never saw Versailles again. Within 4 years, his head was in a basket. And here is the part that should stop you. The most famous revolution in modern history, the one that gave us the words liberty, equality, and fraternity, was set alight in that particular moment by the price of a loaf of bread. In Paris that year, a laborer could be spending half his wages on bread alone, and in the worst weeks, far more than that. Wheat fed the French monarchy. Wheat also destroyed it. But wheat's story does not begin in Paris. It does not begin in a palace or a bakery at all. It begins more than 10,000 years earlier on a dry hillside in the Middle East with a wild grass that nobody had the faintest use for. This is the history of wheat. Our story starts in a region we now call the Fertile Crescent, a great arc of land curving up through what is now Iraq and Syria and southern Turkey. 10 or 11,000 years ago, this was not farmland. It was open country, and growing wild across it were 2 scruffy grasses. We call them einkorn and emmer. They were not impressive. The seeds were small and hard, locked inside tough husks. You could not simply pick them and eat them. You had to gather them, thresh them, grind them, and cook them. And for all that effort, you got a mouthful of coarse porridge. And there was a much bigger problem than that. A wild grass has one job, which is to scatter its children as far from itself as possible. So when the seeds of wild wheat ripen, the stalk that holds them becomes brittle, and it snaps. The ear shatters. The grains fly off in the wind or fall to the ground, and the plant has done exactly what it needed to do. Which is a disaster if you are a human being with a basket. You walk up to a field of ripe wild wheat, you reach out, and the moment you touch it, the harvest explodes and vanishes into the dirt at your feet. The plant is designed, quite deliberately, to escape you. For thousands of years, people gathered wild wheat anyway. There are sites in Syria where hunter-gatherers were harvesting and grinding wild cereals more than 11,000 years ago, long before anybody planted anything on purpose. It was hard work for a small reward. And then something happened that changed the species. Not our species. Wheats. Every so often, in a wild field, a single plant is born with a defect. A mutation in the stalk means the ear does not shatter. It ripens and it holds on. The seeds sit there, waiting, going nowhere. In nature, that plant is a failure. It cannot scatter. Its children die directly beneath it, crowded and shaded out, and the line ends. That mutation should have been erased from the world every single time it appeared. But now put a human being in the field with a flint sickle and a basket. Which plants do they walk away with? The ones that shattered on contact and blew away? Or the ones that held on to their seeds, quietly, waiting to be carried home? They took the broken ones, every single time. And then, back at the settlement, they spilled some and dropped some and eventually planted some. And the following year, the field around their camp was full of the defective wheat. The plant that could not survive without help had found something that would help it. Nobody designed this. Nobody understood it. It happened slowly, over centuries, by accident, and it produced the single most consequential relationship in human history. Because here is what wheat got out of the deal. That broken plant now covers more of the surface of the earth than any other food crop we grow. And here is what it cost. Every grain of wheat on this planet, in every field, in every country, is now completely helpless. It cannot sow itself. It cannot spread. Not one field of modern wheat anywhere on Earth would survive more than a generation or two if human beings simply walked away. We did not conquer wheat. We made a bargain with it, and we have never once been allowed to stop. Because the moment you plant a field, you cannot leave. You have to stay through the growing season and guard it and harvest it and store it. And to store it, you need a building. And once you have a building full of grain, you have something no hunter-gatherer ever had. You have a surplus. That surplus is where everything else comes from. A village that has a granary can feed people who are not farming. It can feed a potter, a soldier, a priest, a king. It can support a population that grows far beyond what wild food could ever carry. Wheat did not simply feed civilization. Wheat is the reason civilization was possible at all. And now, here is the part of wheat's story that most people never learn. Grain in a granary raises an awkward question, and the question is, whose is it? How much did each family put in? How much can each take out? How much does the temple take? How much does the palace take? You cannot hold that in your head. You have to write it down. In Mesopotamia, in the cities of Sumer, the earliest writing we have is not poetry. It is not scripture. It is not a king boasting about his victories. It is accounting. Clay tablets scratched with marks, recording quantities of grain and beer and livestock. So many measures received, so many measures owed, so many measures issued to this man on this day. Writing. The technology that lets a human being speak across 5,000 years appears to have been invented in large part to keep track of who owed how much wheat. And with the accounting comes the other thing, the tax. The moment the temple can count the grain, the temple can take a share of the grain, and once it can take a share, it can pay soldiers with it. And once it can pay soldiers, it can make you pay. The granary, the ledger, the tax, and the state, all of them arrive together, and all of them are standing on a pile of grain. Egypt turned this into an art form. Egyptian workers were paid in bread and beer, both of them made from emmer wheat, both of them measured out by the state as a daily ration. The pyramids were not built by wage labor as we understand it. They were built by men who were fed. There is a lovely old story about how leavened bread was discovered. It says that an Egyptian baker left a bowl of dough out and forgot about it. And when he came back, the wild yeast in the air had got into it and the dough had risen, and instead of throwing it away, he baked it, and it came out light and soft and airy. Whether it happened exactly that way, nobody can say. But leavened bread does seem to appear first in Egypt, and it does depend on wild yeast finding wet flour, and somewhere, at some point, somebody did leave a bowl out. By the time of Rome, wheat had stopped being merely food and had become a matter of state security. The city of Rome, at its height, held something like 1 million people. It could not possibly feed itself, so it fed on the empire. Grain came in by ship from Sicily, from North Africa, and above all from Egypt, which alone supplied perhaps 1/3 of what the city ate. Rome annexed Egypt in the year 30 before the Common Era, and from then on, whoever controlled Egypt held Rome by the throat. The politicians understood exactly what this meant. In 123 before the Common Era, a reformer named Gaius Gracchus pushed through a law guaranteeing citizens grain at a fixed, subsidized price. It was wildly popular, and it made him enemies who eventually killed him. But the idea did not die with him. Under the Emperor Augustus, the state took personal charge of the supply, and the subsidy grew into the grain dole. At its height, something like 200,000 adult male citizens of Rome were entitled to a monthly allowance of grain, collected with a small token at a fixed place in the city, from a state that had staked its legitimacy on that grain arriving. Later, emperors went further and simply handed out baked bread. The Emperor Claudius created a dedicated official whose whole job was the grain supply. By the 4th century, the city had hundreds of granaries and hundreds of state-regulated bakeries. We remember the phrase "bread and circuses" as a sneer, a comment about a decadent population being distracted with entertainment. But look at the order of the words. The bread comes first. The circuses were optional. The bread was not. Every Roman emperor knew that if the grain fleet from Egypt was late, there would be riots in the streets within days and the mob would come looking for him. Rome did not fall because of bread. But for centuries, it did not fall, in part because of bread. That lesson never went away. In medieval Europe, the lord of the manor did not simply own the land. In much of Europe, he owned the mill, and he required, by law, that every peasant bring their grain to his mill and pay him a cut to grind it. Grinding your own wheat at home with a hand quern could be a crime. There are records of monasteries seizing hand mills from villagers and smashing them. And the language remembers all of this. The English word lord comes from an old term meaning the guardian of the loaf. The word lady comes from a term meaning the one who needs the loaf. Power in the English language is, quite literally, spelled out in bread. Which brings us back to those women on the road to Versailles. By 1789, France was in trouble. Harvests had been bad. A brutal winter had frozen the rivers and stopped the mills. The price of bread had climbed to a level where an ordinary working family could be spending most of what they earned on it and still not have enough. There is a famous story attached to all this. It says that when Queen Marie Antoinette was told that the people had no bread, she replied that they should eat cake instead. It is one of the most quoted sentences in European history. She almost certainly never said it. The line appears in a book written by the philosopher Rousseau, describing a great princess, and he was writing it when Marie Antoinette was a child in Austria who had never set foot in France. The quote was attached to her later by people who wanted her hated. But like many legends, it points at something real. It survived because it captured perfectly how the hungry felt about the people at the top. And when a country reaches the point where a made-up sentence about bread can help destroy a queen, the monarchy is already finished. It just has not been told yet. Across the Channel, the British were about to run the same experiment with better paperwork. In 1815, with the Napoleonic Wars finally over, the British Parliament passed the Corn Laws. The word corn in Britain simply meant grain, and in practice it meant wheat. The law blocked foreign wheat from entering the country until the domestic price had climbed to a very high level. Ask yourself who benefited. The men who owned the wheat fields of England were, to a remarkable degree, the same men who sat in Parliament. They had just voted themselves an expensive loaf. British landlords got rich, British workers got hungry, and the factory owners, who were paying wages that had to cover that expensive bread, got furious. Out of that fury came something new. In 1839, in Manchester, the Anti-Corn Law League was founded. It was a middle-class movement, and it invented a great deal of modern political campaigning as it went. Mass rallies, pamphlets by the tens of thousands, petitions. It even helped fund the launch of a weekly newspaper in 1843, specifically to argue the case for free trade. That newspaper is called The Economist, and it is still published today. For years, the landlords held the line. And then, in 1845, the potato crop failed in Ireland and people began to starve. The Prime Minister was Sir Robert Peel, a Conservative, the leader of the Party of the Landowners. He looked at a famine in Ireland and a law that made imported food expensive, and he changed his mind. In 1846, he forced the repeal of the Corn Laws through Parliament, against the ferocious opposition of his own side. It destroyed him. His party split. He was out of office within months, and the Conservatives were cast into the wilderness for a generation. He knew it would happen, and he did it anyway. And Britain, the greatest industrial power on earth, became a country that fed itself on imported wheat. Free trade, the idea that would define the British 19th century, was born in an argument about the price of a loaf. Then, in the 1870s, wheat changed again, in the mill. For thousands of years, flour had been ground between stones. Stone milling crushes the whole grain together, so the flour carries the oily germ and the bran with it, which makes it darker and makes it go rancid within weeks. White flour existed, but it had to be sifted laboriously, and it was expensive, and it was a luxury of the rich. Then came the steel roller mill. Instead of crushing the grain, it cracks it open between steel rollers and lets the miller separate the parts cleanly and at speed. Suddenly, pure white flour could be made cheaply, in enormous quantity, and it kept almost indefinitely because the part that goes rancid had been removed. White bread, which for all of history had been a marker of wealth, dropped within a few decades into the reach of ordinary people. It was a genuine democratization, and everybody wanted it. It also meant that the germ and the bran, which carry most of the vitamins and most of the fiber in a grain of wheat, were now being stripped out and sold as animal feed. We spent the next century slowly working out what we had thrown away and then adding some of it back into the flour by law. Meanwhile, the wheat itself was moving west. The great grasslands of North America had been held together for thousands of years by deep-rooted native prairie sod. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that sod was cut open and turned over, and wheat was planted in it, on a scale nothing in history could match. During the First World War, with Europe's fields turned into trenches, wheat prices soared, and American farmers were urged to plow everything they had. They did. Millions more acres of grassland went under the blade. Then the rain stopped. The 1930s brought drought to the southern plains, and the wheat failed, and there was nothing left holding the soil down. The dirt simply lifted into the air. Dust storms rolled across the plains that turned day into night, buried fences and machinery, and choked the lungs of children. On one Sunday in April of 1935, a storm swept in so vast and so black that people who saw it coming thought the world was ending. The Dust Bowl drove hundreds of thousands of people off their land, and it was not a natural disaster. It was a wheat disaster. It was what happened when a crop that cannot look after itself was planted across country that had never been asked to grow it. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, wheat did something that saved more human lives than almost any other event in history. The problem was simple. If you want more grain from a field, you feed it fertilizer. But when you feed a tall old wheat plant, it grows taller and the head gets heavier, and one day the whole crop lies down flat in the mud and rots. Farmers call it lodging. It put a hard ceiling on how much wheat any field could produce. The answer, when it came from Japan. Japanese breeders had developed a short, stiff, stubby wheat called Norin 10. It did not shoot up when fed. It stayed low, and it held itself upright, and it put everything it had into the grain. Norin 10 was carried to the United States after the Second World War, and from there it reached a young American agronomist working in Mexico named Norman Borlaug. Beginning in the 1950s, Borlaug crossed that Japanese dwarfing trait into the wheat of the developing world, working in the fields himself year after year, growing 2 generations a year by shuttling his crops between 2 Mexican climates to double his speed. The result was a plant that could take heavy fertilizer and stay standing, and yield 2 or 3 times what the old wheat had. Mexico, which had been importing wheat, became an exporter in the 1960s. In 1965, the seeds went to India and Pakistan, where famine was widely predicted and the experts were openly writing off hundreds of millions of people. By 1968, India was bringing in record harvests and running out of places to store the grain. In 1970, Norman Borlaug was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Not the prize for medicine, not the prize for chemistry, the Peace Prize for wheat. The estimates of how many lives that work saved run into the hundreds of millions. It remains one of the strangest facts about the modern world that the man who is credited with saving more human beings than anyone in history is somebody almost nobody can name. And wheat has never stopped being political. In 1972, the Soviet Union suffered a catastrophic harvest, and rather than announce it, Soviet buyers went quietly into the American market and bought wheat from one broker after another, none of whom knew what the others were selling. By the time Washington worked out what had happened, an enormous share of the American crop was gone, sold cheaply and even subsidized on the way out. Grain prices around the world jumped and food got more expensive for everybody. The American press called it the Great Grain Robbery, which brings us, at last, to now. To today, to whatever you had for breakfast. Wheat is grown on more land than any other food crop on this planet. World production has more than tripled since 1960, from a little over 200 million tons to more than 750 million. And it did that while the amount of land under wheat grew by only around a tenth. That gap is Borlaug. That gap is the reason there are 8 billion of us, and the old dangers are still there. A country's wheat supply is still a weapon. When war closes a port on the Black Sea, the price of bread moves in cities on the other side of the world, and governments that have nothing to do with the fighting start to worry about their own streets. The plant itself is still fragile. A virulent strain of stem rust, a fungus, was found in Uganda at the end of the 1990s and has been spreading ever since, and it can strip a field to nothing. Breeders are running against it, and so far they are staying ahead, and the race does not end. Deep inside a mountain on an Arctic island, in a vault cut into the permafrost, hundreds of thousands of seed samples sit sealed in foil, waiting. A great many of them are wheat. It is the closest thing our species has to a fire escape. So think back for a moment on the whole journey. A scruffy wild grass on a hillside in the Middle East, designed to shatter and blow away from anyone who touched it. One defective plant that could not let go of its own seeds, and a hand that closed around it. A granary, and then a ledger, and then a tax, and then a state. Clay tablets in Sumer, counting out measures of grain and inventing writing to do it. Ships of Egyptian wheat feeding 1 million people in Rome. A lord who owned the mill. Thousands of women walking 12 miles through the rain to Versailles. A British Prime Minister destroying his own career to make bread cheap. The soil of the Great Plains rising into the sky and blowing away. A short, stiff Japanese wheat carried to Mexico that fed 1 billion people who were supposed to starve. And finally, more than 750 million tons a year coming out of the ground all over the world. It is one of the most extraordinary stories any single plant has ever written across human history. And the strangest part of all is how ordinary it feels now. The grass that made us stop wandering, that built the granary and the ledger and the tax and the king, that toppled a monarchy and broke a prime minister and still cannot plant a single seed of itself without a human hand, is now the most unremarkable thing in the world. It is waiting for you in the kitchen tonight, as a loaf in a plastic bag, as flour in a jar, as a bun in a wrapper you will not look at twice. You will probably eat it standing up, staring at your phone without a second thought. But now you know what you are really holding. If this story surprised you, subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories behind the everyday things all around you. Drop a like if you learned something new, and leave a comment telling me which part of Wheat's story surprised you the most. There is a lot more history waiting to be ground.